Managerial Economics. This is, what is it? Meeting number 4, and lecture is number 10. The date tonight is November 1, 2008. And the topic of discussion is Chapter 3, Elasticity. Elasticity. Now, interestingly enough, the chapter is focused on elasticity and demand, or elasticity of demand. But there is no reason not to discuss elasticity of supply. So, first of all, what is elasticity? What is the concept of elasticity? The concept of elasticity is that of what we use in common sense, which is not an economic concept, the common sense concept of responsiveness. How well do we as people or businesses respond to changing economic environment? So responsiveness is usually associated and best normalized, because we can't just say, well, it moved that much or that little, is best normalized as, percentage change of one variable when another variable changes by 1%. So you divide the change, percentage change in one variable by the percentage change in another variable. An example of this will be, we need delta. Delta means change, and the change is normalized to percentage, and we need delta here because one price changes by $2 doesn't mean anything. $2 for the price of, let's say, cooking oil would be an awful lot, and $2 for the price of oil isn't that much. In what sense? Well, cooking oil costs $2, so $2 increase in price is 100%. This is a huge change. But if crude oil is $68, $2 extra, that's like less than, well, it's about 3%. So, in this sense, we need to normalize on percentages. So, because you have one variable responding to a different variable, you have hundreds of different types of elasticities. For any two variables, you can create an elasticity. So, which elasticity do we begin with? And we begin with so-called price elasticity. Well, when we say price elasticity, the term which a lot of economists like to use is own price elasticity. Own price refers to the fact that as delta price of a commodity X changes, what will be, and now we have to have this in percentage terms, what will be the change in quantity? The change in quantity of the same commodity, of the same good X or service X. Okay? So, this is why we call it own price. When the commodity, let's say the price of oil goes up 1%, how much is demand for oil going or up or down? Of course, when price goes up, demand goes down. Alright, well, is demand for oil elastic or inelastic? Yep. Inelastic. So, there are two ways to work around this. One way to work around this is first you define what is elastic, what is inelastic. The other way to work around this, or actually the better way, which I use for myself, is actually to think of one commodity, know whether it's elastic or inelastic, and work through the logic. So, you have three cases. One is elastic, another one is inelastic, and the third case we call it unit elastic. Alright, so if price changes by 1%, is the quantity changing a lot or little? A lot or little?
Sometimes a lot. And sometimes.
No, for oil, for crude oil specifically. For crude oil.
When the price go up?
When the price goes up by 1%, will the quantity drop by 1%?
No.
What, less or more?
Less.
Less. Okay, there you have it. Inelastic. Inelastic. Inelastic means when Px delta percentage is 1%, delta quantity of Px, the delta quantity of x in percentages is close to zero. Close to zero. Let's just say 0.1%. In other words, you raise the price, but the quantity does not respond well. Why the quantity doesn't respond well, we'll discuss soon. In other words, if we define this as elasticity, is this how they use E in the textbook, right? Elasticity, and let's call it X. It will be inelastic. It will be inelastic when the elasticity of X is less than 1. In other words, for 1% increase in price, the quantity will fall by less than 1%. Actually, demand for oil is one of the most inelastic demands out there. Alright, so actually for oil, demand elasticity is close to 0.1%. Alright, 0.1 actually. So you gotta raise quite a lot of the price, gotta raise quite a lot of the price to shrink demand by 1%. This also means the opposite. Now, you gotta think two ways. One way is, okay, if we raise the price, how much is the quantity gonna fall? But you gotta think in practical terms. For OPEC, the question is, how much should we shrink supply, cut oil supply, in order to drive up the price so much? For example, oil price during the meeting of OPEC was like what, 65, right? And OPEC says, well, we want to target for 85, all right? From 65 to 85, how much is this, percentage-wise?
20.
Well, 20, more like 30%, all right? So if they want to raise the price 30%, this means they must cut by a total of roughly 3%, all right? In other words, the ratio of delta price to delta quantity when each is measured in percentage terms is roughly 10 to 1. Again, this is rule of thumb. We know this from econometric studies. We also know it because oil is extremely inelastic. So these guys trying to boost the price by 30%, $20, which is 30%, they got to cut by at least 3%. Well, what's the world oil supply daily, roughly? About 85, 84, 85. So 85, this means that they have to cut 2.5, almost 3 million barrels. Well, how much did they cut?
1.5.
1.5. So with 1.5, they can boost the price roughly 15%, and this will be translated into roughly $10. So if they were shooting for increasing the price of $20, apparently they did not cut enough.
They should cut 3.
They should have cut more. They should have cut roughly 3 million. Of course, the better reaction now, as an economist, too bad they don't hire me, right? As an advisor, they should have cut immediately 3 and say, if the price goes over certain fixed number, like $85 or $90, whatever the target might be, if they target 85, they should allow probably for a $5 plus, $5 minus variation. Of course, the price will fluctuate according to a whole bunch of different factors. And if it goes above 90, they will immediately release $500,000 back on the market. Goes over 100, they'll immediately release maybe $2 million on the market. So that would have been a little more sound decision, but again, why they did what they did, it's hard to say. We just use elementary economic analysis, like chapter 3 stuff, to figure out what happened, why happened, what will be the expected, let's say, midterm effect. Okay? This is good enough? So, elastic means that the EX is greater than 1. And unit elastic simply means that the changes correspond 1 for 1. In other words, 1% increase in price will result in a 1% reduction in the quantity, and the ratio is 1. So these represent definitions. But these definitions are based on common sense business logic. All right? Why is this very important from a business point of view? Well, the answer is very simple. You're a manager, and if you're a manager of a certain company, you have the discretion of pricing your own product. And if you price your own product, whether you produce watches or lamps or Panasonic video cameras, which we use, or even these little markers which I use right now for writing on the board, the marker costs 4 rial a piece, all right? It's like $1 a piece. Well, you may want to see, well, can we just raise to 2 rial? And of course, you can raise it to 2 or to 50 or to 1 million. The question is, how much is the quantity going to shrink, all right? So, this is where elasticity is really important. It is important for pricing purposes. It is important to target revenues. If you want to increase revenues by 20%, depending on the elasticity, you may have to raise the price a little bit, or you may actually have to lower the price, depending on the nature of the product. In other words, you cannot possibly ever know or say for sure that if you raise the price, it will raise the revenues, and vice versa. You can say if you raise the price, you'll raise revenues only if demand is inelastic, all right? Only if demand is inelastic. So, this is why for oil exporting countries, raising the price of oil translates always into higher revenues. But that's only because demand for oil is inelastic. Is that fairly clear? Questions? None. Let's see what's coming up next. What am I supposed to do? So, we call this price elasticity. Sometimes they just call it demand. Demand elasticity. Demand elasticity. Now, let's move on and see a few other things. Yes, sometimes they call it, again, price and whatnot. So, this definition here, this definition of EX, is simply called coefficient of elasticity. In other words, coefficient of elasticity is defined as delta quantity in percentage terms, defined by delta price in percentage terms, and is the natural measurement of the elasticity of demand. Okay? elasticity of demand, or own price elasticity of demand. Sometimes we call it demand elasticity, sometimes elasticity of demand. All right? Is this good enough? Let's see, elastic, inelastic. Now, here's another one. Sometimes we call this unit elastic, and sometimes it is typically called unitary elastic. So, both are in common usage. I've seen more often in my career unit elastic, and unitary is relatively rare, but used it in this textbook. In my textbook, it's on page 83. All right? Let's see what else we have. So, responsiveness, and let's provide the concept of responsiveness also in business is best known as sensitivity. Sensitivity. In other words, it simply tells you how consumers or how sensitive consumers are to price changes. All right? That's what it is. This is the interpretation. These two are the common interpretations, but in economics, just call it elasticity. Now, let's try examples of goods. Let's provide 10 different examples and see if they're elastic or not. How do we see? Well, we use a little bit of logic. For oil, we know that oil is inelastic. What about wheat? Is demand for wheat elastic or inelastic? Inelastic, of course. Of course it is inelastic. You may double the price. People aren't going to shrink their consumption in half just because the price went up. Again, we eat what we eat, and that's the end of the story, all right? So, some foods, and how do we call these foods? Do these foods have a special name? We call these foods staples. These foods, which we call staples, usually are, demand is very inelastic, okay? So, another staple is rice, all right? Now, of course, not all foods are inelastic. Examples?
Popcorn. Inelastic.
Yeah, popcorn. Popcorn will be an example of elastic demand. In other words, you double the price of popcorn and demand will collapse. In other words, some foods which are not... Come on, girls, you can't just the two of you talk. If you have, what's the question? That's why I'm here. What's the question? What is it
just asking about staples.
Okay, well, ask me and I'll explain. That's why I'm here. Staples means that is at the core, or it provides a major percentage of the nutrition and is a major percentage of the diet of any particular nation or culture. For Europeans, the staple food is wheat and bread, right? Bread, and the resource is wheat. For Asians, it is mostly rice. And for Americans, corn. All right? So this is what staples is. In other words, when we sit in Bulgaria to eat almost every single time, we're going to have bread. Of course, Italians might not have bread, but they'll have wheat, but pasta, for example, will be. Or they'll have, for the pizza, they're going to still use wheat. It's going to be made out of wheat. All right? But this is what staple means. Represents a significant percentage. Another staple for many cultures or nations is potatoes. All right? Irish and whatnot, potatoes. So this is what staples is. All right? So back to elastic goods. What examples? Or not any. Could be vacations. Well, vacations will oftentimes be very elastic. Yeah, people don't have to necessarily take a vacation. If they don't have the income or are unemployed, or if you raise the price on them, they'll just say, I don't want it. All right? In other words, they can respond. They are very sensitive to the price. All right? but people are not very sensitive to price. So when I go to the store and I buy bread, I'm not that sensitive to the price. I mean, I don't really look if it's 1 or 2 real. I just get one.
Can we use it on services like electricity?
Yes, on electricity, yes. Of course, on services. One very elastic service in the United States is massage. All right? You don't have to have it. All right? Another elastic service is personal fitness trainer. You know, corporations begin to cut down, they start laying off, employees get worried, so usually the corporation, they have a personal fitness trainer, the corporation may have 3 or 5 trainers, and you pay to your trainer maybe 3 times a week for 1 hour, maybe for 20 or 50 hours, depending on, you know, who and where and how and the circumstances. So when people begin to feel that their income might be endangered, they first cut down on their personal trainer. Another thing, fitness. For example, you go to the gym in the US, maybe possibly here, you pay $20 monthly fee, well, could be $100 monthly fee. Well, if you think you got problems, the first thing you cut down is possibly the gym, $100, you stop paying. Sometimes when American families get in trouble, they cut down on cable TV. Or rather than get a premium of 300 cables for $60, they just go with the basic for $12, all right? So let's call it premium channels. Demand for premium channels is very elastic. In other words, part of the elasticity is to what extent it is really, really necessary, or to what extent it is a luxury, all right, will be one of the determinants. A different determinant will be substitutability. To what extent it is easy to substitute and to what extent it is not easy to substitute. Well, electricity actually turns out to be relatively difficult to substitute from a certain point on. In other words, to some extent, demand for electricity is elastic. You know, you double the price, people will see, you know, during the night they'll shut down the lights, all right? During the night, or they will be careful how they use and whatnot. So there is some electricity which early on you could easily cut down. From one point on, the demand for electricity is extremely inelastic. This means I'll go home for 3 hours, I'll have the light on, whether it's 2 cents or 50 cents or $1 per kilowatt, all right? So the fridge will be on anyway. I'm not going to let my food spoil anyway. The water heater, I may not keep 24 hours on, but I'll turn it on at the evening and have it. So I will still have a water heater anyway, right? So you can cut down only so much, and then it becomes extremely difficult to cut, all right? So early on, it will be elastic, and very late on it will be inelastic. So it's very important to understand that not always it is elastic and not always it is inelastic. Well, what is the dread that OPEC countries fear the most? What is the ultimate fear of an OPEC oil exporting country?
It's a new source of energy.
Well, yeah, well, back to the chapter elasticity. OPEC wants to raise as much as possible the price of oil, but not so high to make demand elastic. In other words, you don't want them to begin switching out of oil, all right? Well, why would they switch out, or why would they switch out of oil if the price is too high? Well, because it pays off to switch. In other words, what you want to do is extract the rent. You want to keep the price of oil maybe $10 high. If it's $10 high, all the research and investment of switching out of petroleum and diesel engines into some other engines doesn't pay off. But if the price instead of 100 is 200, and suddenly the differential is $100 per barrel, suddenly there is a tremendous payoff for switching out of oil. So the trick is to raise, but not too much to provide incentive to find alternatives. All right, let's see what else do I have. All right, well, the next thing is section 2, total revenue. Total revenue, I don't want to spend the time on total revenue. The textbook spends an awful lot of time, which is very intuitive, very simple. I found that freshmen usually understand this very well. And I've been using it implicitly all along. If demand is elastic, so let's try this. So for elastic demand, if you raise the price, quantity will fall a lot, right? Remember, that's the definition of elastic. Elastic, you raise the price a little, quantity falls a lot, and the result is that total revenue will fall, all right? Now, elastic demand, if you have it inelastic, you raise the price a lot, quantity falls, but I'm putting here a tiny little arrow, right? A different way to do this. For inelastic, you raise quite a lot the price, quantity falls somewhat, but a lot less percentage-wise, and overall, total revenue goes up. Total revenue goes up. And for unit elastic, or unit elastic, demand, price goes up, let's say 1%, quantity falls down, by definition of unit elastic, exactly 1%, and 1% increase in the one is completely offset by 1% in the other, and total revenue remains flat or unchanged or constant. All right? So that's the basic relationship between total revenue. In other words, if consumers are sensitive, you cannot raise the price on them to change your, to boost your revenues. Of course, if they are elastic, the way to increase your revenues is just lower the price. You lower the price and suddenly they will all be buying your, or a lot more of your good, okay? And vice versa. Let's see what else we have. Changing price and border, equilibrium, numerical examples. Alright, so we move on to the more important section of factors. Factors affecting demand. Sorry, elasticity of demand, which is different. Okay, so what factors do we have? Well, factor number one is availability of substitutes. Availability of substitutes. For us Europeans, there is little substitute for wheat. For Asians, there's fairly little substitute for rice. Also, for us Europeans, there is a lot of substitute for gasoline. What do we substitute gasoline with?
Petrov.
With diesel. All right, but diesel is also made from oil, all right? So, demand in Europe is fairly elastic of gasoline, but jointly with diesel, both are produced out of oil. Demand for oil is fairly inelastic once again, all right? So, that's... I told the story about using LPG. You know what's LPG? LPG is propane butane, and this is what I've been driving back home in Bulgaria, my BMW. So it is a bottle which you use for cooking. It's like home gas, right? Propane butane. They fill it in. It has a little converter which, you know, you drive it. Actually dries a little better and a little nicer than gasoline, and better and nicer than diesel. But again, it is still an oil derivative. Even though it is gas, it is used as a byproduct of production of oil. All right. In Bulgaria and now in Europe, very popular is methane. Methane is a gas which is typically a byproduct of oil production. When you have an oil field, of course, gas always flows up to the top simply because it's light, and that gas is going to be methane. Then you have propane, butane, propane, etc., in a higher order of carbohydrate. So, turns out that methane, very, very good, much better than diesel, much better than gasoline. The car runs smoother, nicer, and all the good engineering properties. But again, same old story. You need the production of oil, and then you get the methane as an extra product, okay?
Excuse me?
Okay, question?
Don't they get methane from cornfields?
Yes, they do. We can discuss this probably not now, but I can get in a couple of minutes. Yes, they do. They get it from corn, from all sorts of bioproducts. Very true.
Even from cow.
From cow, right. All right. Yes, they do that. But the answer is, if you do it from corn, the production of corn actually required oil derivatives, gasoline or diesel in the first place to get the corn, all right? So the tricky part is that this type of biofuel is a net energy loser. What does it mean, a net energy loser? You gotta put in, let's say, 2 calories of energy in order to produce 1 calorie of the output. Actually, you are better off burning all or the oil directly into the car rather than burning the oil to produce the corn and then get from the corn that fuel and then use it as a fuel. All right? So when you try to use it directly, it doesn't work. Of course, you can just use whatever the refuse. You could otherwise throw that stuff away, you know, and instead of throwing, you can get part of the methane. It's a whole different story altogether. So overall, substitutes are very important. So that's number 1. Textbook doesn't say economists aren't very sensitive to cultural issues, so culture doesn't exist in economics, means nothing. Let's put in factor number 0, culture. How about if we cut the price of pork here? How? No demand. Well, what if we lower the price 10 times?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. All right. So this is an example of culture. Cultural. You can lower the price 2, 3, 5, 10 times, and it's still demand will not respond. Demand is close to 0 now, and will remain close to 0 anyway, because it's part of the culture. Where I come from, we usually don't eat horse meat. It's considered pretty bad. No one want to eat horse meat. You can lower the price as much as you want. People still will not eat horse meat, as an example. So, culture is an important factor in elasticity. Okay? So, that's one example. Substitutes is another one. Of course, culture is not present in the textbook, but it's nice to know. Percentage of budget. So, percentage of budget, we just call, instead of percentage, we use the word share. Budget share. The general rule is fairly simple. If it is a tiny, tiny little portion of the budget, then demand is relatively inelastic, right? For example, let's say I lost here the button on the shirt, whether it costs, how do you call it, 100, so what's the, 10 halal, how do you call it? Right? Huh? Halal. Okay, so whether it's 10 halal or 50 halal or a real, if I really need it because I think I need it, I'll just buy one. I'm not going to be very, very sensitive. On the other hand, if something takes a substantial portion of the budget, example will be for a poor family, food will be very important share, will have a significant share. You have a lot of Bulgarian families, and Bulgarian families will have a fairly low income. Let's say $800 or $1,000 per month will be the total income for the Bulgarian family. So, if they have a car and gasoline in Bulgaria is about 15 times more expensive than over here. So suddenly, you're the family, you get, let's say, $800, and gasoline will be consuming roughly $150 out of your budget. If the price of gas goes up, you're suddenly very sensitive to the price of gasoline. In other words, if the budget, the share of the budget is large, maybe 10, 20, 30%, then you're extremely sensitive. Then you begin to figure out, are we going to go here, are we going to go there, or do we have to use the car today or tomorrow? All right? Here in Saudi Arabia, example is the price of gasoline is so small relative to overall incomes that it doesn't really matter. You know, tomorrow the prices could be doubled and you still won't change much of your driving habits, right? Now, some of the poorest might, all right? So, budget share is extremely important. Also, for very poor countries, where food is 50, 60, 70% of the total budget, you could actually have fundamental changes in the whole diet and everything just because the price of food went up 20%. Of course, you got to understand, if, for example, you're poor, the food is taking 60% of your budget, and suddenly the price of food doubles, of course, you can't even buy the same old quantity that you were buying before. So, of course, you will do a lot of substitution from normal foods to some inferior foods. Maybe buy a whole lot more, let's say, potatoes and cut down almost completely on meat, because meat suddenly is terribly expensive, all right? So, budget share, it's very logical, very, very common sense. Now, the third thing which we discussed, I think, a while ago is time, which was sometimes called period of adjustment. The time or period of adjustment is very simple and easy. In the very short time, or the shorter the period of reaction, the more inelastic it is. If I go to the store and they double the price of bread for me, in one day I can't respond. I'll buy it, and next time I'll be looking to buy it for somewhere else. In other words, sometimes it takes information in order to adjust. I'm not going to be using this shirt, I'm going to go and buy somewhere else shirt, all right, or something else. So sometimes it just takes pure time. I can't just go and buy it from somewhere else, you know, I'm going to get it now. Sometimes it takes information. You see that prices have more or less doubled, but probably they didn't double everywhere. Someone may have raised the price only 70%. So we need to find the information and then adjust. Third way of adjustment, and this is the biggest one, which takes the most, is capital. Usually adjustments require one form or another of capital. An example of an adjustment that you see, well, you haven't seen, I have seen in Bulgaria is electricity became so expensive for ordinary Bulgarians that they actually begin to use high efficiency bulbs. Rather than using those ordinary bulbs, they use those high efficiency bulbs like, you know, the one over here, right? Is it showing up? This bulb is currently 10 watts, all right? I use it not because it's cheap, I use it because it provides white light, all right, rather than yellow light. But Bulgarians use it because in the long run, it is a whole lot cheaper. It produces about 10 times more light per 1 watt. The different ways they can get the same lighting for 10 times less quantity of electricity, and that is why they're using it. But of course, it takes capital. You can't, you know, just walk in the store and suddenly buy 20 bulbs. Well, some people will do, but they're fairly expensive. Bulgaria, they cost like $15, $10–15 per piece. A lot of families can't afford and buy all of them. They'll buy 2 or 3 for the rooms where they use most. Another example of capital is, okay, the price of electricity went up 3 times. Suddenly, the fridge becomes consuming too much, all right? Before it was consuming $20 a month, suddenly it's consuming $60. For Saudis, that's not a big deal, but for a poor Bulgarian family of $500 a month, whether your fridge consumes 20 or 60, suddenly becomes very important. Well, suddenly it makes sense to buy a new fridge. But of course, a new fridge requires capital. The fridge costs more than the monthly income of the family. So suddenly they got to save for a couple of months to get that new fridge, all right? Of course, when we talk about cars, is probably the most easiest example to understand. The price of oil goes up. Suddenly, both gasoline and diesel prices go up together, but diesel provides 30% more mileage per liter of diesel versus liter of gasoline. So Europeans are switching from gasoline to diesel. But of course, a car costs 20,000 euro or $20,000 or 30,000, something in that range. You can't just switch like that. You don't flip a switch. Usually, you gotta save money. On a macro level, of course, the society cannot switch immediately. You got to produce 10 million cars, and then you switch 10 million gasoline cars with 10 million diesels. But there's another problem. You already invested in a gasoline car. Just because you switched from a gasoline to diesel, the old gasoline doesn't mean you're just going to throw it away. It's already capital. It's already an investment. You're just going to use it less, all right? An example in the United States would be the 1970s. 1960s were characterized by these huge gasoline cars like Corvettes and Mustangs, which had 6, 7, 8 liter engines, right? That would consume an awful lot. And as the 70s went on and the price of oil went up, how much? How many times? During the 70s, how much did the price of oil go up? Did it double? Yeah, during the 70s, from 1970 all the way to 1980. How many times did the price of oil go up? 10 times? 2 times?
No, maybe 10 times.
Well, a lot more.
Okay.
Yes.
So the government cut the...
Well, we're not going to discuss the reasons why they went up. Yeah, that's not the topic. The topic is elasticity.
But it's that time.
Yes, that's the time. Well, that was number 1, the first oil crisis, 1973, 1974. You had the so-called Yom Kippur War, right? Americans and other Western countries supported Israel. So, Arabic oil exporting countries cut off oil. Suddenly, the price of oil shot up 3 or 5 times. 1979, you have the Iranian hostage crisis, blah, blah, blah. I should know more than me about this. What happens? Same old story. Disruptions. Again, may not have been intentional, but the end result was a disruption. Again, price of oil shoots up 2 or 3 times. Overall, from 1968 all the way to 1980, the price of oil went up 30 times. 30 times. From $1.20 all the way to 45. All right? 30 times. So, dollar all the way to $45, $20, $30, $50. Anyway, so when the price of oil goes up 20, 30 times, suddenly all of these gas guzzling machines become a nightmare. All right? An average guy can't even just use the car and, pay 20 times or 10 times more for gasoline. So people begin switching. But the switching process takes 5 or 10 years. The same old story. You need to produce 100 million cars in order to switch most of those old cars. And when you switch most of those old cars, doesn't mean you throw them in the dumpster or the junkyard. It means somebody keeps it and drives it a lot less. Rather than driving an average 1,000 miles per month, you drive it 100 miles per month. All right? So the key is capital. The key is capital. Building 100 million new cars requires a lot of capital. It requires a concentration of capital. Society should concentrate for 10 years. Society can't just produce 100 million cars in 1 year or 1 month to switch the car part. So, capital is extremely important. Let's see what else for time. Well, I don't have anything. Let's take a break right now for how many? 10 minutes. Push.